Okay. Well, vagueness has to do with borderline cases. So, for example, if you take a spectrum of colors from red to orange, there are shades in the middle which are neither clearly red nor clearly not red. They're borderline cases of red, and it turns out that this very ordinary phenomenon has quite serious implications in logic and other areas of philosophy. This is something that the ancient Greeks were aware of. They already knew about a paradox, the Sorites paradox, which one can explain something like this. Imagine that you have a heap of grains of sand, let's say, and you take just one grain away from the heap, and then ask yourself the question: Is what's left still a heap? And of course, the obvious answer is yes. But that answer implies the principle that if you take one grain away from a heap, what's left is still a heap. And if you apply that principle over and over again, as one grain after another is subtracted from the heap, you eventually find yourself saying that it's still a heap when there are 3 grains left, when there are 2, 1, 0. And so that principle has led to an absurd result. And it doesn't really seem to be enough just to reject the principle, because if you simply reject the principle, by standard reasoning, what you're saying is that there was some particular grain such that when you took it away from a heap, what was left was not a heap. So there was one grain that made the difference between having a heap and not having a heap. And many philosophers think that doesn't make any sense, because the concept of a heap is too vague to allow that kind of sharp boundary. And so what these kind of examples, which have been, as I say, have been known since ancient times, what they've suggested to a lot of philosophers is that there's something about standard forms of logical reasoning which doesn't work for vague concepts and vague language. And in particular, standard logic is based on the principle that every statement is either true or false and not both. And there's a suspicion in many people's minds that principle only really works for precise statements of the kind that perhaps one has in mathematics, and doesn't work as soon as some kind of vagueness comes in. And that has pretty radical implications, because virtually all the language that we ordinarily use is vague. And so if this line of thought is correct, then standard principles of logic don't apply to ordinary language and ordinary thought. And some very radical alternatives have been proposed. The one that is perhaps best known is called fuzzy logic, which has even been claimed to be the basis of certain washing machines and other household appliances. But I mean, this is in general, it's a problem to work out what kind of framework is needed for reasoning with vague concepts. Yeah. Well, the epistemic view of vagueness defends the idea that the distinction between truth and falsity applies even to vague languages and vague concepts, so that when you say something like this shade is red, that's either true or false, even if it's a borderline case. And so in particular, there is a a specific point at which you take away a grain and you had a heap before and you don't have a heap afterwards. And that means that standard principles of logic and reasoning can be applied even to vague languages and vague ways of thinking. Now, the real challenge for the view is to explain how this kind of ignorance arises, because although there is a sharp boundary on the epistemic view, it's clear that we don't know where it is, because we don't know where the line comes between shades that are red and shades that are not red, and we don't know which grain was the grain that made the difference between having a heap and not having a heap. And what I've tried to do in the book is to explain how this kind of ignorance can be predicted on the basis of general principles about knowledge. And the kind of phenomenon that I've connected it with is the sort of difficulty that we have in estimating quantities just on the basis of casual perception. So just to take an example, if you go to a football match and you just glance round, you can try to estimate how many people are present in the stadium, but you won't know exactly how many there are. And I mean, the reason for that is that even if you made a guess as to how many there were, and even if your guess amazingly turned out to be exactly correct, it still wouldn't be knowledge, because your judgment would be far too unreliable to be a case of knowledge. And what I've argued in the book is that something similar goes on in the case of vagueness, but in the case of vagueness, it doesn't have to do with limitations on our eyesight or limitations on our ability to count a large number of objects. It has to do with limitations on the way in which we understand words and grasp concepts in cases of vagueness, so that we do it through examples, not through any kind of precise definition being given to us when we learn the language as children. And so that the result of that is that we're not in a position to make reliable judgments about whether something is read or not read in cases which are close to the boundary. But that doesn't mean that there's no boundary. It just means that we can't know where the boundary comes. Yeah, well, for example, we can often know that something is red, or I can know that the shirt that I'm wearing is not red, even though red is a vague concept. And that's because we can make reliable judgments when they're not too close to the boundary. And that's similar to the fact that in the football stadium, for example, even though you don't know exactly how many people are present, you do know some facts about how many people are present. I mean, you know that, let's say that the number present is more than 50 and less than 50 million. I mean, you probably know something much more precise than that about it, but at least you know that amount. And that's because those figures are not close to the boundary between how many there are, so that 50 is well below the exact figure and 50 million is well above. And so when you're far from the boundary, your judgments are reliable, and so that you can have knowledge, but when you're close to the boundary, they're unreliable and you can't know.